All right, welcome. My name's Chris Bortlick. I'm an architect at the Microsoft Technology Center in Boston. How many of you are actually using Yammer today within your organizations? All of you, awesome. So what we're going to talk about today is how we can leverage Yammer for employee engagement, but how we can actually monitor sentiment analysis if we want to understand if there's positive or potentially negative things being said so we can take action upon it. The way we're going to cover this is we're going to go through some business requirements around the scenario we're trying to address. We'll then go through a demonstration where I'll look at it from the person that's submitting the feedback through Yammer, as well as the person that might be moderating or listening for feedback. And then we'll actually go behind the scenes to actually see how we can set this up. I actually have a blog post that's been out for a few months that actually walks you through all of the steps to actually build this solution. And I actually was able to port this from one environment to another in less than an hour. So hopefully when we come out of this, you have some actionable steps and things that you could apply within your own Yammer network as well. So the business requirements and the scenario around this is, I was working with a customer at the Microsoft Technology Center in Boston. And how many of you have been to an MTC before? A few of you. So there's about 50 Microsoft Technology Centers across the world. We do a number of things like strategy sessions, technical design sessions, workshops, and things like that. And I was working with a customer that was concerned with starting to roll Yammer out widely. They were concerned about people potentially saying things that might be perceived as negative. And my initial reaction is, well, I understand that, but they're saying it anyways. They're either saying it to each other face-to-face, they're doing it in email, they're doing it on tools you don't want them to use, like Blind and elsewhere. So we actually want to get that sentiment out there. But I can understand the need, especially in regulated industries where I work with quite heavily, to actually get a pulse of what's going on. And then I took a step back and thought about, well, how does Microsoft, how do we use Yammer internally? And one of the ways that we often talk about publicly is we actually leverage Yammer in a number of ways within Microsoft. One of which is our CEO, Satya Nadella, actually leverages Yammer to engage our worldwide community to get feedback. And we crowdsource topics, we crowdsource questions, and a lot of those topics then get bubbled up into Satya's monthly town hall that we leverage Yammer and live events to actually broadcast across our company to actually engage our employees. And a lot of those topics actually come from Yammer through what we call the CEO Connection Group. And a lot of organizations I know are starting to do this or already doing this where they want to engage employees in a dialogue with senior leaders, whether it's the CEO, whether the head of HR, different department leads. And this was kind of the business use case that I was going after for this customer I was working with. Well, then they said, as I mentioned, well, we're concerned if anyone can say anything to the CEO or anyone can say anything in this group, how are we going to know if they're saying something negative? And again, it's not that we want to necessarily police people, because everyone knows in this environment, your name is attached to it. It's not like you're posting something anonymous. And we often had a saying, you can say and do anything you want at your last day at any company, right? Whether saying to someone verbally, putting it in an email, putting it on Yammer, putting it in any other tool that's out there. But their concern wasn't so much that people might say something negative, it's that they might miss the feedback in a long set of posts that are there. Maybe the moderator of the community isn't often in there and they may miss things. Or maybe they want to understand the sentiment over time. Was there a certain announcement that happened that all of a sudden we saw a spike in negative posts and negative questions? Maybe it was related to benefits or the stock price or whatever, and we want to actually get some historical trends that maybe we can map back to other data that's happening within the company or outside the company. So the other requirement was that sometimes maybe we post a question, but maybe, let's say HR is monitoring some of the feedback. They may want a private space to collaborate and have an internal back channel to talk about it and figure out how we're going to respond. So as an example, maybe feedback is around pay equality. Maybe it's around benefits, vacation days, what have you. Maybe they may not be ready to just respond publicly to the entire company, but they need a private space where they can actually work and collaborate on a response that they then share back publicly with the rest of the company through Yammer. As I mentioned, maybe they want to have historical reporting and trending, so we can use this as kind of benchmarking ourselves day over day to see what the pulse of the company is, in addition to other listening vehicles like regular HR surveys and polls that we ask in a more formal and structured manner. But this is giving you more of the ad hoc sentiment over time. And another requirement was we wanted to, where we could, leverage out-of-the-box and kind of no-code, low-code, citizen developer type solutions. So the idea is we could build this solution, but then enable someone, potentially as a business analyst or an HR professional, to modify and extend it over time as they may have new ideas or new questions or new ways they want to use the solution. And I just mentioned, again, really having this forum where people can actually, again, maintain the solution over time. So these were the business requirements that this customer presented to me. And as I worked with them, I realized this was not something unique to this one customer. This was a pattern I was hearing more and more from many of my customers. So I actually took some time to actually build a solution and then actually put out a blog post that I'll review with you later. But I actually want to kind of walk you through how this all works. So I see a lot of head nodding, so it kind of sounds like questions that many of you are being asked already, which is great. But before I do that, I just wanted to just kind of reframe some of what you might have seen and heard earlier in the week and throughout the week around the new Yammer, and really how we're positioning Yammer as the place for building communities, sharing knowledge, and engaging employees. As Dan Holm often talks about, this is one of the superpowers of Yammer, is its ability to engage and connect employees across location, across roles, and also engage them with senior leaders in a way that is very transparent and open. Core to Yammer and core scenarios we see with Yammer is certainly this leadership engagement, like the CEO Connection example that I'll be reviewing with you. Company-wide communications, really knowledge sharing and how this is going to tie into Project Cortex, which Satya announced during the keynote, and there's a few sessions for asking questions and then actually mining that information and mapping it back to topics. And then overall improving the employee experience, driving employee engagement by helping all employees to feel like they're empowered, driving them to share their feedback with us, whether it's positive feedback or potentially negative feedback, and also engaging not just knowledge workers, but also these first-line workers, the people that are closest to the customer. That might be people that are in the manufacturing facility or driving trucks or serving customers in a retail environment. So making sure that all of these employees have a voice and can be engaged with. And again, Yammer is built on top of things across Microsoft 365, like SharePoint for files, and integrated, as you've been seeing with things like Microsoft Teams and even Outlook, again, to actually bridge the different communication platforms across Office 365. So I just wanted to kind of just reinforce some of the messages you've heard during the week around how Yammer fits into the rest of Office 365 and really how we think about its role going forward. So with that, I'm going to jump into the scenario demonstration. Most of the session will actually be live demonstration. And then at the end, I'll go back and actually give you a single slide that goes through all of the different building blocks across Microsoft 365, including Power Automate and Azure Cognitive Services that I've integrated into the solution. So I'm going to have three personas in this demo. One is the person that is submitting feedback or submitting a question potentially. One is the person that might be reviewing and listening to responding to that. And then I'll actually go behind the scenes and show you the setup of the solution. All right. And then I'll go through at the end this blog post that actually is the public set of resources that you can leverage when you go back to your office next week. So this is a CEO Connection. Again, this is still in the classic version of Yammer. We actually have this solution built in and integrated with the Yammer booth. So the Yammer team has a booth here on the show floor. I actually work with them to build this solution into their demo environment that they use at the booth, which actually has the new Yammer experience. As you know, that'll be rolling out over the next few months. But for now, this is something you can be leveraging today, and it is fully compatible with the new Yammer and the new Yammer user experience. So once that is running, I've already kind of tested it in both classic Yammer as well as the new Yammer as well. So the idea is that I'm here in the CEO Connection group, and I may want to ask some questions. So you can see there's other questions that have been posted around, why has our stock price been performing so poorly? People asking questions about the all hands, saying they might be frustrated with things like our low market share. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use the Yammer question type because I want to post a question for a leader. If you haven't seen this yet, the new question type is great because you can ask a question and either the person that asked the question or the moderator of the Yammer community can actually mark questions as being answered or not. And they can also say of the replies, which reply is actually the best response. In the new Yammer, you'll see the ability to pin conversations, the ability to close conversations, as well as different treatments on the user experience to differentiate between regular posts versus question posts. So it'll actually be much more visual to people. But for now, I want to go ahead and ask a question. And usually I'll throw it out to the room, but I can't really hear you all with everything else going on the show flow. The floor show here. So I'm going to go ahead and ask a question to say, I don't know, what are we doing to address our loss of employees in. So I'm going to go ahead and just post a basic question, right? What are we doing to address our loss of employees? Kind of a general question. We'll see what the sentiment analysis actually thinks about the post. So the idea is that I have a Microsoft flow, part of Power Automate, that's actually monitoring the Yammer group, and it's looking for certain posts that are being done. It usually takes a few minutes to kind of trigger, so I'll kind of walk you through one that I've already done, and then we'll go back and we'll look at the sentiment that it evaluated for this one. So initially, when I went ahead and posted the one earlier in the week around the stock price, it went through sentiment analysis, and it determined that that post was deemed to be negative. And you'll see that it actually gave it a score, and it actually gave it 0.08, which is considered to be very negative, and actually gave a link directly inside of the email message that allows someone or a group of people to actually receive a message and then click a link and actually go directly to the message that was posted. I also created, though, a Microsoft team. So as you might know, Microsoft Teams, by default, are private, so that anyone within the company could potentially request access, but only the members of the team actually have access to the conversations and the posts. So you see for the one that I posted earlier in the week, it actually was deemed negative. And in addition to emailing specific people, it actually cross-posted the message directly into a Microsoft team that is geared for HR professionals. And again, they have a link to the message, and they can go out and explore it. But one of the nice things that we have is integration of Yammer directly inside of Microsoft Teams. So rather than having HR have to leave the team that they're working in, they can actually pivot directly to Yammer, and they can actually see different conversations that are posted. They could even share something from Yammer and post it back into a private channel. So if they wanted to bring a conversation from Yammer into Teams and then have a private conversation, we also have the ability to do that. Now, what's happening is when I'm going out and I'm looking at the different posts that are being done, I'm actually storing the posts inside of a SharePoint list in order to have the ability to log all of the results over time. So the idea is that someone posts something, I'm going ahead and I'm looking at the sentiment of it. Is it positive or negative? And then I'm actually logging it somewhere that I can build a report on later on. So I could have logged it anywhere. I could have put it inside of a SharePoint list as I did because I wanted a non-professional developer to actually manage it. I could have stored it to a database like SQL or Oracle or put it inside of the Common Data Service. I could have put it in an Excel spreadsheet. You get the idea. I wanted to log it somewhere that made it easier for me to get back to. But once I log all of that, I was then able to actually build a Power BI report in a dashboard that can actually look at the posts over time and actually give me the average score of all of the posts over time. So this dashboard gives me visibility into trends. So now, not only can I look at all of the different posts that are there and respond to each one individually, I can actually go ahead and say, maybe to my colleague Magnus, looks like the average sentiment is going down. Let's review. And now Magnus, when Magnus comes in, actually gets context around the report, and we can have a dialogue about it, and other members of the HR collaboration team actually get visibility into the conversations. You don't have to tell them where the report is. This report is actually scheduled to refresh on a nightly basis, so there's no human intervention where someone has to go out and hit refresh and constantly rerun the report. So again, this is something that I found very helpful. The other thing that we can do is we can bring in other information from beyond just what's happening inside of Yammer in those reports. So in this case, maybe we have a live event that we actually have the monthly town hall. And we want to also look at things like feedback we've gotten during the town hall. So maybe there was a Microsoft form being used for actually polling employees to ask them their feedback. So not just relying on analyzing sentiment based on what was posted into Yammer, but actually go ahead and ask them directly for their feedback. And again, have direct visibility into those reports over time. Make sense so far? All right. So the other decision that I decided to do was not only did I want to share this report with HR professionals, I wanted to have the ability to embed this in the HR website. So imagine that in the company there's an intranet, and at the top of the intranet there's your corporate landing page managed by corporate communications. But maybe there is a landing site that is for HR, and it's HR communicating to the company. So for example, we're highlighting a chatbot where people can ask questions of HR about policies and procedures and benefits. Maybe we're linking out to a Power App that lets them request time off, much like Microsoft does, where we actually can embed time and attendance requests. But, information around building your career. But I've also gone ahead and said, we've heard your feedback. So maybe I want to share with employees, maybe not all the private conversations about the sentiment, but maybe we want to actually put the dashboard out there for certain people to view. So I actually have a page that's built here where maybe we're showing information that's coming from a survey that we show inside of Excel. But here again is that same Power BI report, just embedded within a web part inside of a SharePoint page. So the idea is I can build that report once, and I can publish that report into multiple places. I can put it inside of a private team so that HR can view it and have a conversation. I can also put it out into a more public team site that everyone across the organization can view and participate. So those are the key parts of the experience from an end user perspective. Any questions so far? It's making sense? All right. So let's go behind the scenes and actually look at how this was built. So I actually used a Microsoft Flow, now known as Power Automate. And there actually is a Flow template that was pre-built that allows you to connect to a Yammer group and actually monitor it and connect to Azure Cognitive Services to do sentiment analysis. What I did, what was unique, was I actually added some additional capabilities around the alerting, the logging to a list, and then actually building a Power BI dashboard. Now this flow, when I built it, if you're not familiar with Flow as part of Power Automate, there are personal flows that are your individual flows. When I created the flow, I actually made it a team flow. So I've actually shared this flow with others. So you can see that in addition to myself, my colleague Paul, as well as all of the people that are in the Microsoft Technology Center that are determined to be architects, are actually having access to manage the flow. So if I leave the organization, these other architects can also get access to it. You can see within here, here's the execution of the prior flow. So the one that we submitted earlier kicked out. It looks like I got an email notification that it did in fact determine that that flow was negative. And you see this one was a slightly better score than the one I had posted earlier in the week, which was 0.08. This was deemed to be 0.2. So basically, it's considered to be 12% positive or potentially 88% negative. And again, it looks a lot of times at the content that's here, and it's looking for certain words. So I think loss is considered a pretty strong word that has a strong negative connotation. Now, typically, the shorter the post, the more accurate I've seen that the sentiment analysis is. Longer posts, it's kind of looking at the words and looking at the average. So again, it's not a perfect solution yet. It's still getting better over time and learning. But the key thing is this is built on top of Azure Cognitive Services. And these same Azure Cognitive Services are being used by Microsoft to build our own solutions, including things like AI Builder, which is part of the Power Platform, as well as other pieces of Microsoft. So as we continue to train the model, as we get smarter with sentiment analysis, as you build your own models, as you give us feedback, that same model just gets smarter and smarter. The model can also do not only understanding the sentiment, it can also do things like language translation. So imagine a post was being done in a different language. I happen to speak English. Microsoft's a global company with global employees using that same group. And as you probably know, Yammer can do translation of messages, so I can read a response and I can respond, and the recipient can view it in their own language. But we can actually translate it as part of the flow to actually understand the sentiment and then actually translate it to the local language of the people that are actually consuming it. So maybe HR maybe only speaks English, and they want to have the ability to review the post in their native language as well. And again, just so you know, I'm not making things up. If I go back over to here, you can see here is that post from 1256, also then cross-posted into the Microsoft team, in addition to going directly to me as an individual. So if I go into the flow, I can see the prior executions. I'm going to go in and I'm actually going to go ahead and edit the flow. Now, how many of you have used Microsoft Flow and now Power Automate before? A few of you, maybe about a third of you have used it. So again, as I mentioned, this is an out-of-the-box flow template that already existed. Again, I'll show you how to do it. But there's basically, if you search for the word sentiment when you're building a flow, one of the templates already built that knows how to detect sentiment is actually monitoring Yammer groups. So the first thing that the template asks is what network are you connected to. So my demo environment is called 1MTC. So in your company, it would be your company name. And then it asks me which group do I want to monitor. So in this case, I'm monitoring a specific group. So it's not monitoring all of the groups across Yammer, because that would be kind of overwhelming to get all of that. The other thing that often comes up is you may want different people to be monitoring and responding to different groups. So maybe the CEO connection group is being monitored and managed by the CEO's office. Maybe the HR feedback community is being managed by folks in HR, the finance community by the finance department. So you actually may want to have different instances of this flow that are targeting different Yammer communities, formerly known as Yammer groups, so it can direct the feedback and the question to the appropriate teams of people to respond to it. So step one is connecting to your Yammer network, then connecting and picking the right Yammer community, currently known as a group, but as you heard in the keynotes, now will be referred to as Yammer communities. Once we do that, then it's actually leveraging what's known as the Azure Cognitive Services. Now, this is the one place where a citizen developer typically will need help from an IT professional. Basically, when you do this flow, it asks for two questions. It requires you to have a web service, an endpoint, inside of the Azure service for your subscription to consume. So it's basically asking for the URL for your instance of the Azure Sentiment, the Azure Text Analysis Service. And then it asks for a private key. And that private key is basically a string. It's a unique identifier that allows only people with that key to actually call and connect to the service, right? Because you don't want external companies and others to consume all of your Azure services. Again, as the Power Platform does more and more directly with Azure, this is one of those areas where they'll start to mask some of those dependencies so that a Power user doesn't have to go to IT and say, hey, what's the endpoint in Azure and what's the key? It'll actually be like AI Builder is, where it'll actually say, hey, I just want to do sentiment analysis. Give me a function, and then behind the scenes, just wire it up with the right pieces in Azure. But that's just a piece where I just want you to know that that is something where typically, if you don't have access to your Azure subscription and aren't able to create an Azure text analysis service, you might have to work with folks in IT, if it's not you, to actually give you access to the URL for the endpoint, as well as the key. Everything else from here, I did as myself without requiring any additional setup. Then once I detect the sentiment, I went ahead and I actually logged this to a SharePoint list. So inside of that HR site, I'll show you, I actually created a SharePoint list that I called CEO Connection Sentiment Analysis. And again, I could have used a database, I could have used a spreadsheet. I decided to log this to a SharePoint list. If I actually look at the list itself, you'll see that there are a number of columns that are part of the list. So I am logging the title, the score as a number, so that's the value that's coming back from the Azure Sentiment Analysis, a direct link to the message, so I can give that link back to someone to go directly to the Yammer post. And that's really it. Otherwise, I'm just grabbing basic SharePoint fields, who created it, when they created it, and when they modified it. Now, one thing you might notice is that the flow is actually running under the context of me. So when I go back and look at it, the flow I actually created under my identity. So I could have created the flow under a shared account, but again, I'm using the typical citizen developer type scenario. I created the flow under me, which is why all of the posts are actually showing that the row in the list was actually being created by me, because I was the run that the flow is running under the context of. So that's why everything says created by me and modified by me, because the flow is actually running as me. But the values of the post could have been from anyone else across the company, and we could have even grabbed from Yammer who actually submitted the feedback to Yammer, but I just wanted to kind of expose that to you as well. We go back to the flow. So basically it's saying, okay, connect to this SharePoint list, this SharePoint site rather, and then within the HR website, use the SharePoint list. And then these are the fields I want to pass. I want to pass the message item from Yammer. I want to pass the score from the Azure Sentiment Analysis, and then the URL from Yammer. And I just post that directly there, and then SharePoint automatically knows how to do the created by, the modified by, as well as the create date and the modify date, just naturally as part of inserting a row into a SharePoint list. Then the last piece of it is actually checking the sentiment. So I'm basically then just doing an if statement to say, if the score that came back from sentiment analysis is less than 0.3, then go ahead and perform some action. Right? So this is what we deem to be negative. You could have a higher or lower threshold. So you could say 0.3 might be too high or too low for your company. You basically would just change it, say instead of being a 30% or lower. You could say 20% or 50%. It's really up to you how you want to define that threshold. But then basically it goes through it. It does the translation. So it takes the post and it translates it into a specific language. It could send a push notification. So Flow has the ability to do things with alerts and basically doing things like a Flow button. So if you actually have the Microsoft Flow app, you could do things like actually kick off a flow just by actually triggering a flow manually, or you can actually get an alert. So in this case, I could get an alert through Microsoft Flow that would actually buzz me and tell me when there was a negative post. Okay, not something you necessarily have to do, but some people may want to actually get not just an email message sent to them, might actually want to get a notification that buzzes them on their phone. So I'm actually sending a push notification directly to the device. And then I'm just sending an email. For now, I'm basically just using Flow to say, the negative comment was this, and I'm sending the translated text in with the sentiment analysis score, and then again, a link directly to the actual article. For now, I chose to hard-code it and send it to a specific person, as well as the email address for the channel in Teams. So there's other ways you could have done this, but I took the simple path for now, which was I just grabbed the email address for the channel from Teams, and then I just put that into the to-line. I also put in the email address for myself. Again, this could be a group of people. Again, there's other ways you could post it into Teams. I just took the simple path, which is to say, email directly to this person, or email to this Yammer channel, this Teams channel rather, and then I just basically built an email based on the template. And that's really it. Again, because it's Flow, or now Power Automate, I could add whatever other conditional logic and branching logic that I wanted to. I could do more advanced things with the no case. I'm basically saying if it's not negative, I really don't care. I'm logging it to a list, and then someone can go ahead and look at that report over time. Now, the other thing that I did is I went ahead and I leveraged Power BI. How many of you have used Power BI before? A few of you? So what I did with Power BI is I basically connected it to a SharePoint list. So I used the Power BI desktop tool to go ahead and say, query a SharePoint list. I then mapped the fields into the report. And then the most challenging thing was just basically doing an average. So what I didn't want to do in the report is I didn't want to just show all of the posts, because imagine this wasn't a demo environment and there were actually a lot of posts going on every day. I don't want to show all of the posts on the chart. I just wanted to show the average. So once a day, the Power BI report is actually running on a schedule, and I've set the frequency to basically refresh the report once a day. And once it does it, it automatically publishes the report back out. And then I just use the Power BI tab inside of Microsoft Teams to embed the report in the channel, which is basically how that Power BI report is showing up here. I just use the Power BI tab within Microsoft Teams to embed the report. And then within inside of the SharePoint site, that page I was showing you, I basically just let's go back here. I basically just use the Power BI web part for SharePoint to embed that same report directly in the page. So again, no code. It was basically creating the Power BI report with the desktop client, consuming the SharePoint list, publishing the report back to the Power BI service, and then within the Power BI service, turning on the ability for it to refresh the data nightly without the requirement for someone to open up the desktop every day, hit refresh, and publish it back out. So I think that was it from the core kind of scenario setup. Any questions so far on the setup and the different component parts that are there? Yeah. I can't really hear you, so I'll come down to you, and then I'll repeat it for everyone else. How do you get the sentiment analysis behind the scenes? Meaning, to actually see, how do you get the score? Sure. So the way we got the score was actually as part of the flow. It actually went ahead and did the check from the Azure Cognitive Service, and it actually gave me the score back as a field that I can then do whatever I want with it. So basically, this one action is connecting to the Azure Tech Service and doing sentiment analysis, and then giving me the score back as a value. Can you see the service itself? So there's really not a lot to it. So I'll just go ahead and real quick just spin one up for you all. So it's a text analytics service inside of Azure. And basically, I'll just build one real quick. So I'm sorry? There's a demo page on it? Yeah. you can actually go in. So the comment is that there's a demo page within Azure where you can go in and put in different values. I'm going to just go ahead and show you real quick the flow that's here and how I built this. So if you search on sentiment analysis, you'll find that there are a number of different use cases for leveraging sentiment analysis with flow. One is to monitor Twitter. Imagine you want to monitor external sentiment. What are people saying about our brand on Twitter? In this case, I'm monitoring the Yammer one. There's other ones out here. It looks like mainly around Twitter and other services, things like Eventbrite even. So when I went ahead and did this, the first question that it asks me is, it asks me, what account do I want to connect to Yammer? And I've already established the connection, so I'm logged in as me. So it knew to connect to Yammer as me. It asked me for the connection to the text analytics service, which is where I had to go ahead and get that API endpoint as well as the key. And then it asks me for just a connection to the Microsoft Translator. And because I've already gone ahead and built those connections, this flow is actually going to just work. And then the flow, as you can see here, basically just starts to look at, give me the network name, give me the group ID, and then it knows how to do the checks. And again, I just went ahead and then just basically amended the out-of-the-box flow to do all the extra steps that are there. So that's literally all that it takes to build this flow. In fact, if you look at this article, which I'll give you the direct URL when I go back to the slides, it actually walks you through the use case on how to set this up, and it actually has screenshots of the behind the scenes as well as the user experience. So if you wanted to review this with others on your team, if you wanted to share it with people that might manage your Azure subscription to get access to the cognitive services, this actually walks you through the use case. It walks you through the solution architecture of how this was all built. And then there's actually an article that we link to that actually has a zip file that has a bit more packaged up around actually using the flow. And it talks about the prerequisites where, again, you have to have an Azure subscription with the right permissions to access the Azure resource. And again, you don't need to have direct access yourself. If you're not an Azure admin, you don't have the ability to create Azure services. You just need to know the endpoint as well as the key in order to consume the Azure service. And then it just walks you through screenshots of setting up the Yammer group if you haven't done this already. We walk you through actually creating the SharePoint list and the different fields that are there. We walk you through how to build the Power BI report, et cetera. All right. So now that we've done that, I want to walk you through the solution architecture and the components. Again, you have the access to the blog post, which actually has more how to do it. But I want to just talk through logically what I showed you in the demo. So as you're thinking about how do we assemble all these different Lego blocks into this finished solution. So first off, as I mentioned, I used Yammer to create a Yammer community, currently known as Yammer Groups. I created a community for the CEO connection. You can leverage an existing community that's out there. I then leveraged Power Automate, formerly known as Flow, and I leveraged that Flow template for Yammer sentiment analysis, and then made some additional tweaks to it. But I'm really using that Flow to call out to Azure to sentiment analysis, and then go ahead and kick off the email, as well as log it to a SharePoint list. As I mentioned, I use the Azure Cognitive Services, specifically the text sentiment analysis capabilities, within there to actually pass in the post, have Azure do its thing to analyze it, and then it gave me back a score, which I then used to determine is it positive, is it negative, and to take my actions based on that. I leverage the Outlook and Exchange connector to send email. Again, this is just a connector that Flow supports. So I use that to automatically format the email message, send the email message to individuals, post it to the Yammer channel. I leverage a SharePoint list to actually store the Flow results and embed the reports, which are built inside of Power BI. So I use the Power BI desktop client to actually create and publish a report with the Power BI service to actually schedule the automatic daily refresh of the data, as well as then embed that Power BI report with the SharePoint web part, as well as the Teams tab. And lastly, I use Microsoft Teams. I had a private team set up for the HR team to collaborate. And then I leveraged the out-of-the-box tabs for embedding the Yammer group inside of the team. I leveraged the Power BI tab to embed the Power BI report. And we also embedded a Microsoft Form survey, which was that feedback form we might be using throughout the year, whether they're monthly polls that we're doing as part of the CEO connection, whether they're annual polls or quarterly polls, but basically to just show the direct feedback that employees are giving us through Microsoft Forms. So from a resources perspective, this is that article that I just reviewed with you. So when you go to aka.ms Yammer sentiment, the first article on the left is the high-level article that walks you through the business case, the scenario, with screenshots of the solution. It then links both at the top of the article as well as the bottom of the article out to another article on docs.microsoft.com, which actually has the setup instructions. And it walks you through the prerequisites, and it has screenshots of actually how to build and set this up. It also has an export of a zip file for the Microsoft Flow as well. Those of you that are familiar in working with Yammer, I do encourage you to either attend some of the other Yammer sessions that are happening later today or tomorrow or Friday. As you know, all of the sessions, including this one, are being recorded and are generally available within anywhere from 24 to 72 hours. So the slides are all being published. The video recordings are being published. There's also some other community sessions that are being done, things like these theater sessions, where you can also get shorter, kind of 20-minute sessions often around different topics around executive engagement or other parts of the Yammer platform. And again, how Yammer supports the rest of the Microsoft 365 services through things like live events and its integration with Teams and SharePoint, as well as the integration that we're doing inside of Outlook. So with that, I've got about 7 or 8 minutes before the next speaker comes in. I wanted to save time to ask you all if you have any other questions for me and to take any questions that you all might have as part of it or to go over any other part of the solution that I might have gone through a bit too quick for you all. So feel free to ask me any questions. Yeah. I'll come to you because I don't know if we have a mic right now. Yeah.
So I think my question was around the metrics for the sentiment analysis itself, the 30% baseline that you were setting. Is that based off of any kind of industry standard? I know some of it may be based on your culture, but where's a good starting point to start with, right?
Yeah, so the question is, when we built the flow, the out-of-the-box flow template, when it connected to the sentiment analysis, recommended 0.3 as the threshold. And where did that number come from? I honestly don't know. It's a great question. I'm sure there's some thought process and logic behind it. What I find from my experience is the sentiment analysis definitely is getting smarter and smarter and being tuned more and more over time. You'll probably initially at least want to look at the results through the flow. So run through the flow. As this gentleman mentioned, there is the ability to go to the services directly and actually put some things in and see how it rates and evaluates it, just to kind of test it out. A lot of times when you're doing something like this, I often find customers want to start off initially with just kind of listening, kind of logging and reporting before we go too far with rolling it out too broad to kind of see how it's responding in our environment. You might find that the algorithm it's using might think things are more negative than you thought it was or more positive than you thought it was, and you can kind of use that to guide the threshold that you set, right? So sometimes you might look at it and say, well, why did it give it a 0.2? I didn't think it was that negative. Or why did it give it a 0.7? I didn't think it was that positive. So as you get more comfortable with how it scores and evaluates the posts, you'll get more comfortable with what the right threshold is for you. So that's kind of my short answer of saying, I don't really know why we picked 0.3, but from my experience, you definitely want to kind of test it, run through some of the posts that you already have, if you already have posts in Yammer, and see how it would have evaluated it, and use that to kind of guide you on how you actually set the bar and set the thresholds. That's a great question. Other questions? Yeah.
Will you be able to break down by things like post type, which post types have certain sentiment, or post with images, or post on live events?
Yeah, so the question is, can we break down by different post types? So understanding a regular post versus a question, or understand, was it done as part of a live event or as part of a regular event? I haven't looked at that yet. I haven't had time to explore that. Another common thing that comes up that I know that the Azure Cognitive Services support, I just didn't build it in, is the idea around looking at clusters of intent. So there's certain topics or certain themes, right? So people are asking questions, how can we look for and extract things like, was this related to finance or related to HR? Can we start to look for topics? That's honestly a lot of what Project Cortex is doing. So when I started doing this, a true story, I built it, I rolled it out. I then started to get a whole bunch of customers ask me for more advanced scenarios. I had Microsoft IT come to me and say, this is great. We actually want to put this on Satya's CEO Connection group. And I had the head of Microsoft US saying she wants this on her Yammer community as well. But some of the more advanced things were actually things that we're actually building into things like Project Cortex and into AI Builder, which was above and beyond kind of my quick little proof of concept. So the core platform can do it. I just didn't do it with this because it's a bit more lifting and work to take it out. And under the covers, Azure has something called Lewis, which you do language, understanding, and intent, and you can start to look for topics and themes and intents and start to cluster it. That's actually what a lot of the newer services like AI Builder as well as Project Cortex are being built upon. So I know the product can do it. It's just a question of how much do you want to do yourselves versus waiting for our product teams to actually build natively into the product. Any other questions? Yeah. Sure.
Is there a way to do this based on the topic of the question, for example? So not about doing sentiment analysis for every post in that group, but for specific topics.
Yeah, so the question is there the ability to go ahead and do this, not just for every post in the group, but to do it specifically for certain post types? So yeah, when you get the post back, you can certainly take the post that was there and you can look for certain keywords. So you can pull that out because we're actually pumping that value into the sentiment analysis service to actually do it. So one of the values that comes back when you read the Yammer post is you do get the content of the post. I actually stuffed that into the email message as an example. So you could say, if this comes in, go ahead and look for certain keywords like finance or HR. You can do basic things, certainly like log it into a list, maybe pull out a piece of metadata, attach that to a column if you see those words that are there. So yeah, you could do that. That could address some of your question as well, where again, maybe we're not building a full system that's looking for all the topics and the intent, but just doing basic things like looking for certain hard-coded phrases like finance or HR or certain topics, and then maybe logging a column in the SharePoint list that you can then report and filter on. I haven't looked to see if you can pull back the question type or the topic type to see, is this a question or is this just a regular post or is this praise? I also haven't looked much at whether or not you can look for the initial post versus the responses. Right, so again, I know those data elements are there because we use them within the system. I just haven't had time to go ahead and play around with it here, but I know the data elements are there, so you can definitely kind of pull that through when you get the Yammer message back. Yeah.
Slow, right? At what point of time this core analysis will run? Actually, is it instant or wait until the questionnaire complete or whatever the response is complete?
Yeah, so I think the question is how often does the flow run? So the flow is depends on the version of the service and the license that you have. So I think that flow executions are somewhat bound based on how you've licensed things. So if you use flow just as part of Office 365, you get a certain number of flow executions and a certain SLA, I think, on how often they run. And then there are different license plans for Power Platform, for things like Power Apps and Power Automate and all that give you additional runs with additional frequency. The environment that I'm in actually has the premium version of Power Apps and Flow. So I have the fastest kind of response time. And from my experience, it typically takes a couple of minutes before the flow actually kicks off. So I think from the time I submitted it to the time that I actually showed you other things, it seemed like within about 5 minutes or so, the flow actually kicked off, it processed it, and then the flow itself is actually really quick to run. You can also trigger the flows manually. So when you build a flow, flows have different events. One is based on something happening, meaning I'm looking for a new post to the group. Another option that I could do it based on a timer job, where it's basically running a certain number of hours per day or days per week. Or I can do it based on an action where someone can go ahead and press a flow button on a phone, or they can just go ahead and hit a button in a Power App or something and manually trigger the flow as well. So again, short answer is you can do it scheduled, you can have it based on an event, like when a new record gets submitted to Yammer, or you can do based on a manual trigger as well. Yeah? I'm sorry? Can you splice the data by geography? So I don't know that we capture anything within the Yammer post itself that would directly tell us where the person was from. Certainly if you grab who the person is, because you know that from the Yammer post, and you could look them up inside of Azure Active Directory and the attributes are clean, you could then pull those attributes inside of the flow from Azure AD and then write them out to a list. Another thing you could do, which is not your question, but I think is somewhat related, is potentially look at language as well, which doesn't necessarily tell you where the person is from, but could tell you the language that the posts are being done, because we definitely can take the language and do not just sentiment, but also language translation on it as well. Cool. I have time for maybe one more. If there's anything else? All right. Well, again, feel free to, again, connect with me on Twitter. Again, I do post a lot on my blog as well beyond just the Yammer topics, and appreciate you all coming out today.